Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 28, Take My Debts Away. Over the last two episodes, we talked about the history of New England during the early 1700s, a period which was marked by inconclusive fighting with Quebec. Today we're going to talk about the next few decades of New England's history, with a focus on how Massachusetts actually paid for these very expensive wars. Massachusetts and the American colonies in general had always had problems with a shortage of cash, which made it difficult for the economy to function properly and difficult for the government to collect taxes. Without any money, you have to resort to barter, which is terribly inefficient and seriously hinders the functioning of markets, since it becomes prohibitively expensive to trade with anyone at all. And partly as a result of this shortage, the economy wasn't actually growing all that fast, at least in per capita terms. They had solved, or tried to solve, this problem in various ways, using crops as a commodity money, like tobacco in the Chesapeake for instance, using foreign currencies, using the Indian currency of wampum, tolerating piracy in order to get some of that pirate gold. There were attempts to set up private banks that could issue money, but they failed. Massachusetts had just started minting its own coins in 1652, but it wasn't clear that they had the right to do so, and the practice was ended when their old charter was annulled. You see, Britain didn't want to let its colonies mint their own coins. Following the mercantilist economic philosophy of the time, they wanted to hoard gold and silver within the mother country, rather than letting it flow out to the colonies, so they made sure that the movement of gold and silver was one way only. This policy hurt the colonies economically, but since they existed solely to serve British interests, who cared? So when the wars with Quebec started, Massachusetts needed cash more than ever, but cash was in even shorter supply. So the government hit upon the idea of issuing bills of credit. That is, paper money. Paper money had been invented in China many centuries ago, but in the West in the 1600s it was still a novel idea. In fact, when the colony first issued paper money in 1690, the idea still hadn't even been tried in England yet, though it would be in just a few years. So this was an early experiment, at least within the Western world. The very first issue of paper money was due to that failed invasion of Quebec. The government hadn't made any plans to pay their soldiers, incorrectly assuming that they'd be paid out of the plunder they took. But since the expedition was a complete failure, the government suddenly had to scramble to figure out how to pay the near-mutinous troops. They decided on paper money, basically an IOU. In order to increase confidence in these dubious-seeming IOUs, the government agreed to give a 5% tax break to anyone who paid their taxes with these bills. It worked and the currency was accepted. At first things went well enough, despite some initial doubts. The economy became more efficient and grew as a result. Connecticut also started issuing paper money in 1709 and Rhode Island in 1710. So did many of the other colonies further south. This system was then expanded and fleshed out over the next 3 decades. These days, when the government prints money, every $1 bill is equal in value to every other $1 bill no matter what, but back then it was a little more complicated. Back then the government issued money in batches, so one issue of bills might be printed in 1733 and another in 1735. These bills were then lent to the colonists, who would then spend that money and circulate it throughout the economy. But the important thing is that these different issues of bills could each be redeemed at some point in the future by the government. The money had been given out as a loan, and eventually the government would call in that loan, with different issues of money being redeemed at different times. So really there were a bunch of slightly different currencies going around in the economy rather than one, and they could sometimes vary in value relative to each other. And because the government in printing money was acting as a lender, it could decide to postpone calling in its debts if it so chose. The government could basically say, no, we're not going to be collecting that money we issued in 1733 just yet, even though we said we were going to do it now. This postponement meant that there was more money left in circulation, but it also lowered people's confidence in the money supply, since they were worried that they might not be able to use this money to pay their taxes in the future. Both of these effects meant that if you postponed collecting these bills, the value of the currency would depreciate. So basically inflation. In effect, this is similar to how the government can cause inflation today, just through a different mechanism. The ability for the government to inflate the currency meant that monetary policy quickly became a central political issue. If you inflate the value of money, if you make it so that the dollar is worth less than it was before, some groups will win while others will lose. If you're a debtor, if you owe someone $1,000, then depreciation is good for you. That $1,000 is now worth less than it was before, which means that in order to pay it back, you don't have to give up as much. You effectively owe less money than you used to. If, on the other hand, I'm the creditor who loaned you $1,000, then depreciation is bad news. The $1,000 I was expecting from you is now worth less than it was before, so now I'm poorer than I expected. There are all sorts of other complications to this, of course, but that's the essence of the idea. And inflation, or at least high inflation, could cause problems beyond just making some people more or less wealthy than before. For instance, if you're a debtor and you expect the currency to be worth less in the future, you might postpone payment of your debts until then. It was cheaper to default on your debt and have your creditor take you to court, since by the time the case was resolved, whatever money you owed would be worth so much less. Therefore, big fluctuations in the value of the currency could wreak havoc on all sorts of economic decisions, as well as clogging up the court system. So that's one aspect of monetary policy, how much money to print and how long to keep it in circulation. But there was another complication on top of that. What should this paper money be backed by? Right now the money was backed by the loans that had been taken out to get it, and by the fact that you could pay your taxes with the money. Some people wanted to expand this system through the creation of a bank which would issue even more money backed by silver and gold. Another proposal was to create a land bank. That is, a bank which would offer paper money backed by land rather than by gold or silver. Basically, you as a landowner could take out a loan with the bank, secured against your land. In exchange, the bank would give you money which you could spend, and that money would then circulate through the economy, ultimately backed by the land that had been used to secure those loans. There was a lot of land in Massachusetts, and so a land bank would likely mean a huge expansion in the amount of money in the colony. There were also disputes about who should run such a bank if it was created. Under some proposals it would be private, while in others it would be run by the provincial government. If the government was in charge, then it would be easier for the colonists to get more money printed than if the bank were private, since governments are naturally more responsive to public pressure. I know this might be confusing: inflation, land banks, silver banks, private banks, public banks, but the important thing is this: whether or not there'd be more money in circulation overall. If you supported printing a lot more money, then you probably supported creating a land bank. That was the political axis at the time: more paper money versus less paper money. Everything else is just a particular instance of that bigger struggle. So, which groups supported printing more money and which ones opposed it? Who supported the silver bank or the land bank, and who opposed both of them? Unfortunately, it's difficult to know how or why people voted back then. Even today it can be really hard to figure out what it is that voters want from their politicians. You can multiply those problems 100-fold when it comes to the past. There isn't that much surviving data and there were no formal parties, so figuring out which faction a politician belonged to, if he belonged to one at all, is often a matter of guesswork and interpretation. And on top of all that, politics was much more local back then, which makes generalizations even harder. Did a politician lose re-election because voters changed their mind on some issue? Because of a personal scandal? Because he didn't do enough glad-handing? Because the economy got worse? Because he neglected to get a local bridge repaired? It's often simply impossible to say, and so we can only speak vaguely about how the political process actually worked. Outside of some exceptional periods, a lot of change seems to have been due to random local variation, rather than any grand ideas or interests that would seem important to us today. So the most we can do is look for some general patterns that seem to mostly hold. To that end, we need to turn to a man named Thomas Hutchinson. Hutchinson was both a historian and a politician, who became governor of Massachusetts just before the Revolution. I'll have more to say about him in a later episode, but for now all you need to know is that before he became governor, Hutchinson had been working on a multi-volume history of the colony, one of the more important sources for modern historians. Anyway, Hutchinson identified 3 factions which developed in response to these debates over the currency. These 3 groups would persist in some form for decades, until the American Revolution itself. Not in any organized way, but still recognizable as the same thing. The smallest faction, but still sizable, was the one in favor of ending the experiment with paper money altogether and returning to a system of hard currency. There were always those who saw paper money as a dangerous innovation or some kind of scam, including Hutchinson himself. This faction, centered in Boston and some of the coastal towns, was led by big-time merchants and those who did a lot of business with Britain. They would lose money if inflation were higher. Conservatives like the Mather family were members as well. I'll call this group the non-expansionists. Another faction, much larger, favored a private bank which would issue currency. According to Hutchinson, quote, "This party, generally, consisted of persons in difficult or involved circumstances in trade, or such as were possessed of real estates but had little or no ready money at command, or men of no substance at all." End quote. So mostly people with assets who just lacked cash, basically. They wanted to make sure the economy had enough money for them to trade. I'll call this group the moderates. The third faction, also quite large, favored a public bank. This faction consisted of somewhat poorer farmers and Bostonians. Not the poorest of the poor, but not the comfortably well-off either. Throughout the 1700s, about 40% of the delegates from the rural areas came from this faction, which I'll call the Populists. So the more rural you got and the less rich you were, the more likely you were to favor loose money, which is not too surprising. It's always been the case that farmers, whose livelihoods can be wrecked by a single bad harvest, are at great risk of falling into debt. And really, this is part of a very long tradition of farmers wanting debt relief. I mean, you can go all the way back 4,000 years ago to ancient Mesopotamia, when kings periodically proclaimed jubilees in which all debts were invalidated, as a way of taking pressure off poor farmers. This was just a financially more sophisticated version of the same thing. And we'll see similar concerns again in the late 1800s, with many farmers trying to move the United States away from a strict gold standard in order to cause inflation. Merchants, who were often the guys loaning the money to these farmers, were naturally opposed to such debt relief. However, although paper money was one of the most important issues faced by Massachusetts, it was by no means the only one. Modern historian Mark Egnall, in his book A Mighty Empire, The Origins of the American Revolution, expands upon Hutchinson's three factions. According to him, the two larger factions, the moderates and the populists, were both expansionists. That is, they didn't just want to expand the money supply, they also wanted to expand the European presence in America in general, by growing the economy and moving westwards as fast as possible. They were optimists about America, and they were more gung-ho about the wars with France, especially the moderates, since it meant further opportunities for expansion and inflation. When the War of Independence came, they were enthusiastic supporters. The moderates and the populists had different economic interests, which meant that they didn't always see eye to eye, but in their view of America's future, they were united. On the other hand, the smaller faction, the non-expansionists, also tended to be more pessimistic about America's prospects, at least relative to Europe. Thus, they favored policies which maintained their ties with the mother country, rather than desiring to go their own way. They were more skeptical about the wars with France, and they often remained loyalist to Britain during the Revolution. That's just one interpretation, but it seems plausible enough on the whole. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be all that much research on factionalism in colonial times, at least that I could find, so I've had to rely on fewer sources than I'd have liked, but hopefully nothing is too far off from the truth. It might be more accurate to call these groups interests or even dispositions instead of factions, since they aren't really stable coalitions. Instead, different political alliances will emerge out of these groups, depending on what the important issues of the day are. So the moderates and the non-expansionists might form an alliance for a while before that disintegrates and the moderates instead ally with some of the populists. Okay, so that's the basic dynamic that will be playing out over the next few decades. Various proposals to print more money, backed especially by rural farmers and opposed especially by urban merchants. However, for the first several decades after the introduction of paper money, inflation remained low and the currency was a minor political issue at best. The financial demands of King William's War hadn't been that great, and so the government hadn't had to issue that much paper money. It was only with Queen Anne's War in the 1700s that monetary policy became an ongoing political concern. The government issued more and more money, which of course meant that the value of the currency kept dropping. In fact, Massachusetts often found itself in the weird position of both having an inflated currency and not having enough money to go around, which only led to further demands to print money. Connecticut had similar problems as well. As the war came to a close, a split opened up over what the colony should do. A number of colonists proposed that the government should create a land bank in order to keep issuing more currency even though the war had ended. The idea for a land bank had been around for several decades, but this was the first time that it gained serious traction. The current governor, Joseph Dudley, was opposed, while the supporters of the land bank controlled the lower house of the General Court. Now, in addition to the people of Massachusetts, there were a few other groups which also had a say in whether or not to print more money. Obviously, the colony's government itself had an interest in causing inflation to help pay for the wars. You need more money? Just print more money. What could go wrong? But the British government, which could veto colonial legislation, remember, also had a say, and they opposed inflation. They represented the interests of British merchants who were creditors and thus stood to lose out should the value of colonial currencies be lowered. So Britain not only opposed minting coins, they also opposed printing bills, even when that hurt the colonial economy. Massachusetts wasn't represented in Britain, and so they got the shaft. Britain could and did use its influence to block growth of the money supply, at least sometimes. But in any case, thanks to local opposition, the land bank idea was not passed into law. Instead, the government just printed more money and kept older money in circulation. That was enough for now. With the temporary end of the wars, the currency fight died down for a while. In 1715, Governor Dudley was removed from office and soon replaced by Colonel Samuel Shute, who served from 1716 to 1723. Shute, who had been chosen partly for his opposition to the land bank, was not a native New Englander, and his time in office was very contentious, though not because of the land bank or the currency. Shute quarreled with the General Court over appointments and over his salary. Remember, the governors didn't have a permanent salary and so were at the mercy of the legislature if they wanted to get paid. He tried to veto the lower house's nominee for Speaker of the House. The lower house objected to this interference in their affairs and cut Shute's salary by £200 as punishment. The next year they insisted that Shute approve all their legislation before he be given a salary at all. Shute left for England in 1723 to complain, but he never wound up returning. In his absence, the lieutenant governor, William Dummer, served as acting governor for most of the next 7 years. Under Dummer there was a small war with some Indians, but things mostly remained calm and the currency remained a minor issue. The biggest issue of the day was the so-called explanatory charter. Thanks to disputes between the governors and the General Court over just how powerful the governor actually was, King George I issued an explanatory charter, which was basically an amendment to the Massachusetts Charter, which had been issued by William and Mary in 1691. This new document clarified certain provisions in the old charter and enhanced the governor's powers, though it still didn't give him a fixed salary. In order to go into effect, this explanatory charter had to be passed by the General Court. This was a contentious issue. Both the moderates and the non-expansionists favored adopting the explanatory charter, but the populists were opposed. In any case, the charter was in fact adopted, though it didn't change much, really. The next governor was Jonathan Belcher, who served from 1730 to 1741. Before his appointment as governor, he had been serving as the colony's representative in London. While in England, he apparently managed to convince officials there that, as a native, he might have better luck in convincing the Assembly to give the governor permanent salary. However, he was no more successful than his predecessors had been. Over the 1730s, the currency situation gradually worsened, thanks mostly to Governor Belcher. Belcher had been given specific instructions by the Board of Trade about what to do with the money supply. They wanted him to phase out all paper money over an 11-year period, and move Massachusetts back entirely to a gold and silver economy. This was an extremely ambitious policy, to say the least, and it would have led to a huge contraction in the money supply. However, the General Court resisted the plan. The Board of Trade may have been responding to the concerns of English creditors, but the legislature was responding to the interests of Massachusetts debtors. As a result of this standoff, much less money was issued for a few years. Instead, the bills that were already in circulation were kept in circulation for longer, which led to further economic problems. Governor Belcher was in a difficult position. When he came to an agreement with the General Court to print more money, the Board of Trade threatened to remove him from office. They still wanted Belcher to get rid of paper money altogether. There simply seemed to be no position which would satisfy both the legislature and the Board of Trade. He tried to come up with a compromise position, issuing a new government currency backed by silver and gold, while taking the old currency out of circulation. However, people just hoarded the new currency, since it was seen as more valuable, even as the old currency was being eliminated. Thus, Massachusetts was left without much cash at all. In economics, that's known as Gresham's Law. Bad money drives out good. If people have two currencies to choose from, they'll all hoard the more valuable one, and it may disappear from circulation altogether. As the money supply once again became an important issue, Massachusetts once again became divided over whether to create a bank to issue more currency. The populace supported the creation of a land bank, while the other two factions supported the creation of a bank which would be backed by silver. However, neither proposal got enough support in the General Court to pass, and presumably the governor would have had to veto them anyway. So instead of a public bank run by the government, some of the colonists decided to form a private bank instead. Both a private land bank and a private silver bank were created. The silver bank was supported by merchants, who opposed the land bank. However, the land bank proved widely popular among everyone else. It soon had almost 1,000 subscribers, and its currency went into circulation. Even a few moderates decided to participate in the land bank. However, the Board of Trade continued to oppose any measures which would lead to currency depreciation, even if it wasn't being done by the government itself. So they put pressure on Governor Belcher to quash these banks, and he did what he could to stop them, by forbidding all lawyers and government employees from doing business with the land bank, and firing all those who did. That wasn't enough to stop the land bank's growth, however, and in the elections of 1741, supporters of the land bank became a majority in the General Court, as well as winning many local elections. But whatever the people thought about it, they didn't have the final say. Back in London, Parliament passed legislation which essentially banned the land bank. A firm reminder of who really controlled Massachusetts these days. And so the colony's money supply continued to seesaw back and forth haphazardly. Not good for business. Around this time, Belcher fell from power and was removed from office, although not really because of the currency dispute. Instead, it was because his patrons back in England had themselves fallen from power, so that when his enemies mobilized against him, there was no one in London to look after his interests. Again, politics in Massachusetts had become a function of petty disputes within the British government. Belcher's replacement was William Shirley, who would serve as governor for most of the next 15 years, during the entirety of King George's War and the beginning of the French and Indian War. Shirley had been born in England, but he went to Massachusetts in 1731, not out of any Puritan conviction, which would have been an anachronism at this point, but as an ambitious lawyer looking to make his way in society. Upon arrival, he soon joined the faction opposed to Governor Belcher, and after Belcher was removed, managed to get himself appointed to the job, thanks to his connections back in England, which I guess proved superior to Belcher's connections. Shirley did his best to be cooperative with the General Court. He brought up the issue of a permanent salary, but only briefly and only once, just to get it out of the way. He was conciliatory towards the populace, and he managed to get some of them on his side, but as far as the land bank goes, his hands were tied by Parliament. He had no choice but to impose regulations on the land bank which caused it to swiftly collapse, which of course only led to further economic woes. For example, Samuel Adams Sr., father of the famous revolutionary Samuel Adams, lost most of his wealth. It was not a popular move. John Adams, the future president, who was a child at the time, said that the attack on the land bank was even more hated by the colonists than the hated Stamp Act would be. Things seemed to be going from bad to worse, but before the economy could totally collapse or anything, something happened which interrupted all of these problems: another war with France. So now it's time to jump back to English politics and catch up with the last few decades of events. When we last left England, the War of the Spanish Succession had come to an end, and Queen Anne had just died. Because she had no surviving children, and because Catholics were now legally barred from becoming king or queen, the throne now passed to her second cousin, George I of the House of Hanover. The Hanovers were a moderately important German dynasty who, up until now, had basically nothing to do with Britain. As a foreigner who didn't speak the language that well and spent a lot of time in his native country, King George was naturally less involved in British politics than his predecessors had been, further strengthening Parliament's control. Anne had favoured the Conservative Tory party, but George was concerned by their connection to the Jacobites, the supporters of the Stuart dynasty's claim to the throne, and opponents of the Glorious Revolution. There weren't that many Jacobites left, but they were still seen as a threat to King George's legitimacy. So instead he favoured the Whigs, who entered a period of political dominance which would last decades. Under William and Anne, elections to Parliament had been held every 3 years, which led to a hothouse political atmosphere, where both the Whigs and the Tories fought it out in the press day after day. But in 1716, Parliament passed the Septennial Act, which meant that now elections only had to be held every 7 years. This was partly just a power grab by the Whigs designed to keep themselves in office longer, but it did have the effect of calming things down considerably. It also helped that Europe was entering a period of relative peace. Louis XIV had died in 1715, after 72 years on the throne, so French ambitions were reduced for the time being. England and France even wound up as allies for a while. The most important political development under George I was the creation of the office of Prime Minister. Previously, there had never been a single person in charge of government other than the king himself. Well, now there was, at least unofficially. That man was Robert Walpole. Walpole was a Whig who had joined Parliament in 1701 and gradually risen to prominence. Thanks in part to his deft handling of a financial crisis known as the South Sea Bubble, by 1721 he had become the leading figure in the cabinet, a position he held for the next 2 decades. There had been leaders in the cabinet before, but this was unprecedented. This was a new way of doing things, a new centre of power in which a member of Parliament was placed in charge of the government, permanently dependent on parliamentary support to get anything done. Walpole was very skillful at handling Parliament. He was cautious in his ambitions, and he had good luck in general, allowing him to stay in power for so long. The Tory party receded into near irrelevance. The political scene was as calm as it had been for the better part of a century. George I died in 1727 and was succeeded by his son, George II. Nothing much changed. The new king continued his father's policies and even kept Robert Walpole on as Prime Minister. Walpole continued his grip on power, and Britain continued its headlong transformation into a commercial empire. Peace was maintained thanks to the temporary alliance with France. Walpole's rule was controversial, and he was subject to constant attacks in the press. Often he was accused of corruption. He was corrupt, though probably not more so than his predecessors. He just had such power that most of the corruption and patronage in the realm flowed through his hands, which made him a very obvious target. But despite the constant antagonism, Walpole's skills were such that he managed to survive each crisis as it came up, keeping Parliament and King on his side each time. But they say that all political careers end in failure, and Walpole was no exception. After 30 years of relative peace, war returned. At first the conflict was small, just a trade dispute with Spain, known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. The impact on the American colonies was minimal. However, the struggle went badly for Britain, and Walpole took the blame. In the elections of 1741, he nearly lost his majority, and it was clear that his support was continuing to erode. Soon he would no longer be able to control Parliament. The writing was on the wall, and so Walpole resigned. There were some attempts to prosecute him for corruption, but they came to nothing. His 2 decades as Prime Minister had set a whole bunch of new precedents for British politics, not unlike the presidency of George Washington in America. A new form of government was being worked out on a practical level. Anyway, I'm mentioning all this stuff about English politics partly just to point out that nothing similar was happening in America. There were powerful politicians in the colonies, of course, but none who could be called a prime minister. No one who relied on the support of the legislature in the same way. And neither were the same political factions present in America. By the time of the Glorious Revolution, the colonies and the mother country were set firmly on different political trajectories, even though they remained attached for the better part of a century afterwards. Anyway, although Walpole was gone, the war continued. Actually, a much bigger war was brewing in Europe, one that would swallow up the war with Spain. This bigger war, the War of the Austrian Succession, was, as you probably guessed, fought over the question of who should rule Austria. The main claimant for the throne, the one backed by Britain, was Maria Theresa, mother of Marie Antoinette. France, however, hoping to weaken Austria, backed a different candidate. And so a new war was on, for the future of Central Europe. Once again, Britain and France were at war. But the colonists didn't care about Central Europe. All that mattered to them was that they were at war with Quebec again. In America, the conflict was known as King George's War, a name which made perfect sense at the time, but is a bit confusing these days, given that there were 3 more King Georges in a row after the first one. Anyway, because of the war, the Board of Trade reversed its opposition to paper money for the time being, since they needed Massachusetts to have a functioning economy in order to fight the French. The land bank was still dead, but the government was printing a whole lot more money, so the problems of the last decade temporarily vanished. This had the effect of scrambling the alliances between the populists, moderates, and non-expansionists. Instead of paper money, they were now fighting over the war effort. Governor Shirley was taking aggressive action against Quebec with the support of the moderates and many populists, while the non-expansionists and some populists opposed him. Things had really changed since the Glorious Revolution. Now New Englanders could be downright patriotic about their place in the British Empire, at least when the British weren't annoying them with bad policy decisions. So many Americans took to the war effort with gusto. The English had captured the French fort at Port Royal in the last war, but the French had since built an even stronger fort, Louisbourg, a few hundred miles further up the coast. It had 250 cannons and walls 30 feet high. From this fort they could disrupt English shipping and fishing in the region. But the English had intelligence that the fort was undermanned, and so Governor Shirley decided to launch an attack, with the assistance of the British and the other colonies. Astonishingly, considering the colonists' track record, the attack was a success. The force they sent struggled for the first month of the siege, but then they managed to capture an incoming French warship, carrying supplies and weapons for the fort. The French surrendered soon after that. France tried to send a force to retake Louisbourg, but in a surprising reversal of how things normally went, the French expedition turned out to be a disaster. They didn't even manage to reach their destination. Other than the siege of Louisbourg, the war was mostly just normal raiding back and forth, as well as some privateering at sea. Thankfully it was a brief war, lasting only 4 years, at least in the colonies. Once again, I don't think there's any need to get into how the war went in Europe. The British-backed Maria Theresa became Empress of Austria, but it was just as inconclusive as the wars of the last generation. However, in the final peace treaty, the fort of Louisbourg was returned to the French, which must have severely stung the pride of the New Englanders. But probably the most important impact of the war in Massachusetts was that the colony now had massive debt, and a currency which was worth only like a tenth of what it had been worth a few decades ago. It's not the worst example of hyperinflation in world history, but it wasn't exactly a great track record either. Governor Shirley, who had been the one inflating the currency to fund the war effort, now reversed course and tried to pull things back. This also meant a change in his allies. He shifted away from the populists and towards the non-expansionists. In fact, he shifted hard in the other direction. The British government had agreed to reimburse Massachusetts for some of its war expenses, and it was proposed to use that money to buy back all the paper currency left in circulation, and return Massachusetts to a hard money standard of just silver and gold. Paper money was still popular with many of the colonists, but thanks to all the problems that there had been, the plan won enough support to pass. And so in 1750, Massachusetts ended its experiment with paper money. Not only that, in 1751, the British Parliament passed an act which prohibited the colonies from printing any paper money that wasn't backed up by gold or silver. Now, that didn't mean that the colonists had come up with another solution to replace paper money. Far from it. The switch back to silver and gold meant that once again there wasn't nearly enough currency to go around, and the economy suffered as a result. But for the time being, thanks mostly to British pressure, there was nothing to be done about it. Paper was dead. It's safe to say that this first experiment with paper currency was a failure, at least in Massachusetts, though in other colonies it went better. What accounts for this failure? Well, firstly, I think that Massachusetts was torn between two forces: popular support for inflation and British opposition to inflation. The back and forth between those two sides meant that the amount of money in circulation kept fluctuating, and the colonists always faced an uncertain economic future. How much would your money be worth in a year? How could you know? And in general, it's going to be hard to have a paper currency if you're a colony and your home government is against the idea. Massachusetts simply had limited sovereignty. Secondly, the monetary system was much too open to popular pressure. These days, America's monetary system is controlled by unelected officials at the Federal Reserve, while in Massachusetts, the decision to print money was made by elected officials. Back then, elected officials weren't as responsive to public opinion as they are today, but officials certainly were aware of what their constituents wanted, and they acted accordingly. And thirdly, paper money was a novel experiment, and no one really knew what they were doing yet. Taken together, all of this led to a very unstable system, with periods of rapid expansion of the monetary supply matched by correspondingly rapid contractions, neither of which were good for the economy as a whole. Sometimes there was so little money in circulation that New Englanders had to resort to barter. Arguably, paper money was still better than having no currency at all, but it definitely didn't work as intended. Better luck next time. Next episode, we'll look at the history of Rhode Island during this period, and how a regional rivalry there led to a different sort of factionalism. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.